Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. How's everyone doing today? This is Alex Himes with the Ruckus. Thank you guys for tuning in. I really appreciate it. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day today here in Lexington, Kentucky. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into it. I'd like to say first off, thank you to my guy Malik behind the camera today. Thanks again, Malik. He's giving a thumbs up for everyone. So without further ado, the first thing I'd like to talk about today is why the NBA should get rid of the after action report. So for those of you who don't know, the after action report is a report given by the NBA after games have concluded, discussing the last 2 minutes and the plays called or miscalled, anything of the such in that period. And within the 2-minute report, they basically confirm, telling us the correct calls that were made, correct non-calls that were made, incorrect calls that were made, and incorrect non-calls. And by the non-calls, I mean things that should have been called or should not have been called that were either called or not called during the last 2 minutes. So this is a twofold argument. Just from the fans' perspective and from a reporting perspective, I myself don't want to hear about what the NBA has to say about the plays that either we missed or that were called incorrectly at the end of the games. I mean, we already know that my team, in particular, the Celtics, would have lost or did lose that game because of a missed play or missed call that the referee just didn't see, or they called that shouldn't have happened. We've all been there at the end of games with that ghost foul that ends up occurring where someone gets fouled for no reason and shouldn't have been fouled, and our team loses the game. I don't want to know that. I don't want the NBA coming at me and telling me that, oh yeah, in fact, we did miss those calls. I appreciate them trying to appease to the fan and the player as well and saying, hey, yes, we basically messed up, and the next time we will make sure that we don't miss that play. But all it's done is create more divide, and this is where the players come in. From a player's perspective, I can only imagine how aggravating it is to be told by the NBA that, oh, in fact, that play that you missed or the foul that got called on you didn't count, or the actual play that should have been called, the foul that you should have received going into the paint, driving at the end of the game, was missed or not called. I don't want to know that, and I'm sure the players don't want to hear that. We already have enough players arguing about the officiating as is. This is only infuriating players and even exacerbating the issue as is. So, the updated statistics for the number of incorrect calls or incorrect calls made range from 48 to 120 total calls in the last 115 seconds of the game. Now, those numbers might not mean much, but what that ostensibly is saying is that the amount totals to 1.5 wrong decisions made in the last final 2 minutes of a basketball game, which means the refs are clearly messing up 1.5 times per last 2 minutes of each game. I don't want to know this. I don't want to know this. And as a fan, if anything, I want the NBA to take this away so I don't hear about it and so I don't find out more about why my team should have won that game. Especially with the Celtics, who have 17 out of their last 16 fourth quarter calls going against them. That's aggravating as is. And the NBA knows it, the players know it, and it's creating a bigger divide that we see now with players and referees, and it's only making a bigger issue. So the NBA should get rid of the after action report, and I gotta tell you, I can't think of any bigger or better segue to go with this is Paul George complaining about them being officiated differently. So last night, after the Oklahoma City win against the Orlando Magic, Paul George went to the media and told them that he felt the Oklahoma City Big Three, being him, Westbrook, and Carmelo Anthony, are being officiated differently than the rest of the league. So, for starters, I like to point out one thing. This is his first year with two other really big-name players in a completely different organization on a completely different conference. So, yes, there's going to be some growing pains. You're not going to get the calls that you used to when you were alone in Indiana, now that you are with two guys who are known for being very ball-dominant players who can get fouls at any time in the game when they need to. So, I understand that, and sadly that just comes with the territory. But in crunch time, all three are viewed as receiving calls that favor them rather than against them. That's right. I went up and looked at the statistics from thepudding.com. Thank you for those guys. And they showed that in the last 2 minutes, the same report that I used for the Celtics numbers, it shows that in the last 2 minutes, Paul George, Carmelo Anthony, and Russell Westbrook are three of the most favored players in the NBA to receive calls their way in the last 2 minutes. So I think your argument, Paul, about, being officiated a little differently is kind of yes and no. I kind of agree with you. Yes, you're a very athletic guy who drives the ball to the basket and gives his all on every possession, similar to the other two guys that you're surrounded with, but you're not a LeBron James. And what I mean by that is LeBron has been getting fouled his entire career. His entire career. We've seen him go into the paint, we've seen him take jump shots, and he just isn't he isn't receiving calls that he should receive because of what his body is and how he's just a freak of nature at that position to kind of even out what the other stars at the small forward position have compared to LeBron. You have to give him less calls just to even out the playing field. And I understand that. But LeBron, if anything, has the right to complain about not getting as many fouls as he should. Because this man goes to the basket almost every possession. He's a big integral part as to why we have players complaining about not receiving the fouls these days. And on top of it, the guy is getting older. This is the biggest reason. The guy is getting older. LeBron is getting older and now is starting to feel those fouls take more and more toll on his body. So, of course, the guy is going to want to complain about how he's not receiving those fouls now as opposed to earlier in his career. So, Paul George, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but realistically, man, you don't quantify in the same argument that LeBron does for arguing about not receiving the fouls and being officiated then against the rest of the league. You're just going to have to get used to it, man. So we'll be taking a quick commercial break and be right back. Welcome back, guys. Thank you for taking that quick commercial break with me. So we're jumping right into the next big topic today, and that is the Cavs are evening out. And what I mean is the Cavs are finally, after this trade deadline, and everyone jumping on the Cavaliers for being the favorites to win the East and come out of the Eastern Conference. They're mortal like us. They're just like us. They finally regressed to the mean. We see it now. The Cavaliers have won 3 out of their last 5 games since the trade deadline. And yes, unfortunately, they beat down my Celtics. It was real sad. They beat down the Grizzlies, but then again, everyone beats down the Grizzlies. But they barely escaped Oklahoma City. And I think it should be noted the 2 losses should be bigger than the 2 wins. And by that, they lost to the Spurs and the Wizards. That's right. The wallless Wizards, and also the almost every starless San Antonio Spurs. They lost to that. I get that the Cavaliers have made such big moves. And in all honesty, it's moves that'll better this team, and it's better for LeBron. But what they did? All they did was smooth out their offense and remove one defensive liability. Now that they have Isaiah Thomas on another roster, there isn't another guy competing for ball dominance on the court all the time with LeBron James. So LeBron will have the ball in his hands the entire time with no competition. And he gets younger guys to spread the floor with shooters such as Hood and Clarkson and pick-and-roll perfection players such as Larry Nance Jr. to only make his offensive weapons that much more deadly. And this guy can spread the floor now like none other and give guys like Kyle Korver and J.R. Smith their open shots, which they need to be productive. But their defense hasn't adjusted. I mean, let's just be realistic. In the 2 losses by the undermanned Spurs and the John Wallace Lizards, they were almost blown out. Almost blown out, ladies and gentlemen. This Cavalier squad, I understand, is great, and they retooled. They did everything they could in that moment to give LeBron the best chances to making a deep playoff run and potentially making the finals. But realistically, this team is only going to win by outscoring you. Their defense is going to be the biggest liability all season. And you can see it just by the way they're playing already and how they'll continue to play down the stretch. LeBron doesn't have that much time to develop that defensive, unit in that defensive mindset with these new guys, especially being traded in the middle of the season. So they're relying on scoring and outscoring opponents. This is an attempt to pull the Golden State Warrior game plan maneuver by outscoring your opponents. But they really lack the perimeter threats and the savvy passers to replicate this with true success. And ultimately, their defenders are both a mixture of old and not that great in general. So we're just going to have to see where they go with the Cavaliers, but I don't necessarily see them coming out of the East. I like these trades, like I've said, and Kobe Altman should be commended for the moves that he made at such a short time in the last, day right before the trade deadline. They managed to pull off 3 or 4 different moves, acquiring 6 players and sending out 4. This guy's a wizard. So, going right into the next topic, Unfortunately, I'm going to have to talk about tanking on this show, which I hate discussing because it seems like every other week there's another issue, another article, another report talking about teams tanking in any type of sport, and it's just freaking annoying. But at least in this instance, the man owned up to it, and we're talking about Mark Cuban of the Dallas Mavericks. So the other day, Mark Cuban was caught in a phone conversation that was revealed publicly where he disclosed that he had been tanking for a year and a half and that losing was, in fact, their best option going forward. Which, if you look at the Mavericks roster, it kind of makes sense. When your best player is Harrison Barnes and then your second best player is Dennis Smith Jr., no offense to those guys, but they're young and inexperienced and need to keep building. Especially with Dirk Nowitzki somehow still playing basketball. The guy's like 300 years old and still on the court and putting up jumpers. I don't know how he does it. But Cuban was fined $600,000 by the NBA for these comments, and honestly, all I've got to react to this is, we've known that tanking occurs. We know it. We've seen it throughout the NBA through the years. We see it right now with the process finally starting to process in Philadelphia, and teams love to tank because it makes it easier to acquire the top player in the draft. You get to move up and you get to move on from those years of stagnancy that some teams just kind of get stuck in for not making the right moves, and you move on. Tanking is an essential part of any type of sport in a sense because it evens out the teams that will win and the teams that will lose. And unfortunately, this is one of those instances where tanking is in the NBA, but the only way it'll change, and the only way to get rid of the tanking is by changing the playoff seeding structure. That's right. I said change the playoff format. Like you guys heard in my first take, your take segment at the beginning of the show, it's a necessary evil for the NBA to change the playoff format, and I think that it would be smart to change it to a 16-seeded field where the top 16 teams in the NBA play each other in the playoffs, which will result in more competitive playoff games, a wild and potentially more likely time for upsets where teams that aren't as good will advance long term, and it will weed out the really crummy teams. Yeah, sure, you hear the arguments about, it'll be a Western Conference dominant heavy playoff picture, but that's only for a couple of years. We see these NBA teams in the Eastern Conference really starting to rise. Guys like Giannis on the Bucks. The Toronto Raptors are proving themselves. The Wizards are doing their thing. Charlotte, bless their hearts, they'll get there some point. But you see my point, ladies and gentlemen. The Eastern Conference will even out, and as time goes on, you'll see the balance of power shift from the West to the East and ultimately being even, and ultimately the East will be stronger at one point. That's just how it works. It's just a conference. It's time changes this, and we'll see this occur. But my main point is changing the playoff structure will alter how teams tank, the methods of doing tanking, and the reasoning for tanking, because the competitive atmosphere will be too much for teams like Philadelphia to continue doing a process for multiple years. And at least in this case, I don't care. I genuinely don't care that the Mavericks are tanking and was open to it and admitting to it. At least he's facing the reality, and ultimately in this game, to get better, you have to take time to lose and put yourself in the worst situation to ultimately get to the best. So, we'll see where Mark Cuban ends up with this, but there are many other issues with the Dallas Mavericks, and I think we'll get into that in a little bit, but we'll figure that out soon. Oh, well, I guess we're actually going to be getting into it, Malik. You're going to be talking about it. All right, so with the Dallas Mavericks, another big story has come to light, unfortunately, and that is sexual assault and misconduct is finally hitting the NBA. And unfortunately, it is with the Dallas Mavericks. So, the prior president of operations and CEO, Terdema Usuri, was accused of numerous times over the last 20-year span of sexual assault and misconduct within his time at the Dallas Mavericks workplace. Multiple stories have come out from ex-employees claiming that they were touched, groped, even one woman claiming that he had discussed gangbanging this woman with other members of the Dallas Mavericks organization in a group meeting. Now, pardon my French there. But these reports were made to the HR department, and the victims were intimidated to keep silent, threatened to keep silent, and even told to learn their place. Usuri released a statement saying that these reports were wrong and inflammatory, but this kind of goes against, what's being said, because over the years, if you go back into Dallas newspapers, there have been multiple stories about allegations facing Usuri for sexual assault, for sexual misconduct, and harassment towards employees. This man was the subject of a 6-week internal investigation. Mind you, I use the word internal, and was cleared by the Mavericks. Yes, the guys that were investigating him were the guys who worked for this man. So, of course, they're going to find their boss not guilty or find him not guilty of any wrongdoing. It only makes sense. And sadly, this went left unattended, and the Mavs and him parted 3 years ago because Usry was offered a job at Under Armour. And this man, get this, lasted just 3 months. You want to take a guess why? Oh, well, makes sense, right? The man had a case filed against him with Under Armour as a woman claimed that she was sexually assaulted on an elevator and trapped by him. Now, it looks like Under Armour held this swiftly and carefully because they let Usry go, and he's nowhere to be seen. But this continues, and there's a record of violence and issues towards women and the fair sex, unfortunately, with the Mavericks organization, as they had an on-air personality for years who had been accused, arrested, and tried, and pled guilty to, mind you, assaulting his girlfriend in 2011. That's right. Earl K. Snead is a Mavs on-air personality reporter and pled guilty to assaulting his girlfriend back in 2011. But the Mavs decided to keep him because they put in his contract, get this, a clause saying he would no longer fraternize with employees in-house. That's how they got through this. They made the man sign a contract saying he would not fraternize with any other employees. Well, it looks like that didn't work out either, because back in 2014, Snead dated another Mavs employee and assaulted her. And yet, it only took this story coming to light and everything else being reported beautifully by women such as Rachel Nichols on NBA's The Jump for Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban to fire Snead, which occurred last week. That's right, the man that assaulted his girlfriend in 2011, assaulted another Mavericks employee in 2014, made it to 2018 with that job, that same very job, and was finally fired then. This is disgusting, and I understand that everyone will have their different views and perspectives, and they want to hear the full story. I might not be giving all the details, but this does not excuse a man or two men assaulting women, making a workplace feel like a hostile environment towards women, and treating them as if they were less than human. This is a disgusting story to come out about the Dallas Mavericks, an organization which I once revered and owned by a guy I once viewed as a great businessman and a great person. Mark Cuban needs to step up, and I understand that there could be different ideas of what Mark Cuban should do in this instance, but he needs to get ahead and start making it a priority to make sure his workplace is a relaxing environment that welcomes everyone, not just by gender, by race, by anything you want. Everyone feels welcome and comfortable, and the Dallas Mavericks should have this handled accordingly, and the NBA should investigate this as well if they're smart. So without further ado, my last story of the day is why the Kyrie Irving trade makes sense. Finally, after months of not knowing Malik, I finally get an idea of what's going on. Do you get that? Do you believe me, man? Oh, he believes me. All right, so we're going right into it. Well, the Kyrie Irving trade makes sense. Going back from the beginning, right before this happened, we're talking about 2 days before the draft. The Cavs go into the draft without a GM after previous GM decided it was in the best interest with him and the owner that he would not return. They signed Kobe Altman 2 days after the draft on June 24th. Now, during the draft, apparently, conversations on Kyrie trades discussing what he could bring back in value leaked down to Kyrie, as well as the potential trades for Paul George and Eric Bledsoe that they almost had the trigger pulled on, leaked their way down to Kyrie. And what's his next move? He requests a trade. He requests the trade the same day Altman is hired. Now, my theory here, why this all makes sense, Kyrie was willing to play the second fiddle or second option to LeBron James while they were winning, which makes sense. Winning titles, why screw with what's working? You know? They would do anything to retain LeBron, and the Cavaliers, and I'm talking about the Cavaliers here, the Cavaliers would do anything to retain LeBron James, and Kyrie realized this. He wasn't the assumed heir to LeBron that he once was. Kyrie was expendable. well, and I guess you could say is expendable, or it was expendable, more or less. So he decided to take his fate into his own hands and request a trade to another team that he could lead. And look what ended up happening. He went to the Boston Celtics. But my major point on this story is the Kyrie Irving trade has been so convoluted. We've heard so many different stories about LeBron wanting him gone, Kyrie wanting him gone, them talking bad about each other behind each other's backs. Well, it looks like it was just something as simple as plans during a draft night, potential trade move that were leaked down, that never occurred, mind you. These details leaked down to the player that they incorporated. He had enough, and he decided to take his fate into his own hands, which I have nothing but respect for. Mind you, yes, he is a Boston Celtics, so of course I'm going to love Kyrie Irving, but I have nothing but respect for a player who's willing to take their destiny into their own hands and to make sure they control where they go and what they do. Kyrie Irving made the best decision that he could. He ended up going to another team where he is contending to be number one in the Eastern Conference and potentially going to the finals this year. And it clearly shows how much Cleveland is missing him, because they haven't been able to find steady rhythm since he's been gone. The Kyrie Irving trade makes sense, and it just goes to show you can't always believe what you see in media, including what I report or what anyone else reports. So that's all for today, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to check out my Instagram at HeimsWorld for more behind-the-scenes footage and clips of today's show, just as well as my Facebook page, Alexander Heims, and YouTube page, Alexander Heims, for the full shows, full stories, behind-the-scenes stories, major updates, breaking news, anything that you guys could want. Everyone in Lexington, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate it. To everyone else around the world, I appreciate it as well. Have a great day, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll cause a ruckus next week.